Ignorant or
Therefore, the structural
confrontational,
integrity report
Boss' swift,
confirms
firm
the
reaction to
necessary
protect his
repairs
horses.
cannot be
The
delayed any
mornings were
further.
cool and misty, with the soft sounds of birds and the distant neighs of horses breaking the calm. Boss, the owner of this vast ranch, had lived there most of his life. He was a tall, steady man, his face weathered by years of work under the sun, but his eyes had a warmth that showed a deep love for the animals he cared for. He knew each horse on his ranch by name, by behavior, and by personality. Some were spirited and lively, while others were gentle and calm. To Boss, they were more than just animals. They were friends, companions, and sometimes even teachers in their own quiet ways. The ranch itself was a blend of practicality and comfort. Stables lined the edges of the property, each one carefully built with strong wood and clean interiors. The smell of hay and earth filled the air, a scent that Boss found comforting and grounding. Every morning before the sun had fully risen, he walked through the stables, checking on each horse. He ran his hands along their sleek coats, listened to their soft breathing, and offered gentle words of encouragement. These moments were sacred to him. It was a routine he never missed, and it kept him connected not only to his horses, but to the rhythm of life on the ranch itself. That particular morning started like any other. The sky was painted with shades of pink and orange, and the air held a crisp freshness that made every breath feel clean and light. Boss moved through the stables, feeding the horses their morning grain and water, speaking softly as he worked. The horses responded to him in their own ways. Some nudged his hand for an extra pat, others snorted happily, and a few simply watched him with calm, trusting eyes. It was a harmony that had been built over years of care and attention, and Boss treasured it deeply. After finishing his rounds, Boss stepped outside to survey the larger part of the ranch. The open fields stretched far beyond the stables, dotted with trees and fences that marked different areas for grazing and training. A gentle breeze rustled through the leaves, and the soft sound of hooves echoed from the distant paddocks where the younger horses were learning to run freely. Boss took a deep breath, enjoying the peace of the morning, but he also remained alert. Years of experience had taught him that the ranch, while serene, was full of responsibilities and unexpected events. One moment of carelessness could lead to accidents, especially when dealing with animals as strong and sensitive as horses. As he stood there, a figure appeared on the horizon. At first, Boss thought it was one of the ranch hands, who often came early to help with chores. But as the person came closer, it became clear that this was a stranger. The man walked with a certain confidence, almost arrogance that made Boss uneasy. He was dressed casually, carrying a bag over his shoulder, and seemed completely unfamiliar with the ways of the ranch. Boss's first instinct was to watch quietly, assessing the situation before taking action. He had seen strangers before, some curious and respectful, others careless and reckless. He knew the difference immediately. The stranger approached the stable area, his eyes wandering over the horses with curiosity and maybe even a hint of amusement. He paused in front of one of the stalls and reached out to touch a horse's muzzle. Boss's stomach tightened. Horses could sense nervousness, anger, or uncertainty, and even a small mistake could startle them. He raised his hand slightly, a silent signal for the man to stop, but the stranger continued, clearly unaware of the unspoken rules of the ranch. Boss felt a mix of worry and irritation. He valued patience and kindness, but he also knew that protecting his animals was his first priority. He walked toward the stranger, his steps calm but deliberate. As he approached, the stranger looked up, smiling politely but without understanding the seriousness in Boss's eyes. "Good morning," the man said. "Beautiful horses you have here. Mind if I take a closer look?" Boss stopped a few feet away from him, keeping his voice steady and polite though firm. "These horses are not just for looking at," he said. "They're trained and sensitive. You need to be careful and follow the rules of the ranch. Touching them without permission isn't safe, for you or for the horses." The stranger shrugged, as if Boss's warning was just an inconvenience. "I've handled horses before," he said casually. "I know what I'm doing." His tone was confident, but it carried a slight edge of challenge. Boss immediately recognized that this wasn't just ignorance. The man might be confrontational. Boss's mind raced. He could explain the rules again, he could ask the man to leave politely, or he could take a stronger stance to ensure his horses were safe. Experience had taught him that calm and measured actions were usually the best way to prevent panic or aggression from horses. He decided to maintain his calm but increase his authority. "I appreciate that you've handled horses," he said, "but every animal has its own personality. These horses trust me, and I cannot let anyone risk that trust. Please step back and don't touch them." The stranger's smile faltered slightly, replaced with a hint of frustration. He looked around, seemingly considering whether to comply. Boss could see the tension growing, not only in the stranger but also in the horses. One of the stallions shifted nervously, snorting and pawing at the ground. Boss felt a surge of responsibility. Every instinct told him that he needed to act decisively before anything escalated. While Boss was focused on the stranger, he also noticed the subtle reactions of the ranch hands who had begun to gather behind him. They were silent but attentive, waiting for his direction. He knew that his next steps would set the tone for the rest of the day, not only for the stranger, but also for the horses and everyone else on the ranch. He felt the weight of that responsibility, but did not falter. For Boss, these moments were tests, not just of skill, but of character. Years of working with animals and people had taught him that patience, awareness, and firmness often work together. Too much kindness could be misinterpreted as weakness, while too much force could frighten the horses. The balance had to be perfect. He inhaled deeply, feeling the wind brush across his face, and made a mental note to stay focused, clear, and calm. The stranger, sensing the shift in Boss's demeanor, hesitated. He stepped back slightly, but continued to watch the horses with a mixture of curiosity and defiance. Boss maintained his position, silently signaling that he was in control of the situation. His presence alone was enough to communicate that this was not a casual matter. The ranch, the horses, and everyone involved relied on him to make the right decision. Even as the moment hung in suspense, Boss could not help but notice the beauty around him. The sunlight glimmered on the horses' coats, the breeze carried the scent of hay and earth, and the quiet sounds of life on the ranch continued around them. It reminded him why he had chosen this life: the connection to animals, the responsibility to protect them, and the satisfaction of knowing he was doing something meaningful. But that beauty did not make him forget the potential danger. Boss's eyes met the stranger's again, steady and unwavering. He spoke slowly, ensuring that his words carried weight and clarity. "I need you to leave the stables and respect the rules of this ranch. The horses are not here for anyone's amusement. If you cannot follow that, you will have to leave the property immediately." The stranger paused, clearly realizing that Boss was not someone to be ignored or challenged lightly. There was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, and for a moment the tension seemed to ease. But Boss knew that the situation was still delicate. One wrong move could spook the horses or escalate the confrontation. He continued to hold his ground, silent but alert, ready to act if necessary. The horses themselves seemed to sense the shift. They relaxed slightly, returning to their calm demeanor, trusting Boss to handle the situation. Their reactions gave him a small sense of reassurance. The ranch, the horses, and even the strangers who visited. These were all parts of a delicate balance that required attention, respect, and sometimes firm intervention. In that quiet morning light, with the sun climbing slowly over the hills, Boss prepared for what might come next. He knew that the encounter could end peacefully if the stranger respected his authority. But he also knew that he would do whatever was necessary to protect the animals he had dedicated his life to caring for. In his mind, the rules of respect, patience, and firm leadership were clear. And so he waited, ready for the next move, fully aware that the day's events could turn into something memorable for everyone involved. The stranger hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his options. His eyes flicked from the horses to Boss, trying to measure just how serious this man was. Boss, however, did not waver. He remained calm, standing tall with a steady gaze, letting the authority in his posture speak louder than words. He had learned long ago that animals, and even people, could sense confidence and control. Boss knew that if he lost his calm, the horses might become nervous, and the situation could spiral out of control. The stranger finally spoke, his tone a little sharper now. "I'm just looking. I've worked with horses before. I know how to handle them." There was a hint of defensiveness, but Boss could see past it. He had dealt with many people who thought they understood horses, only to underestimate how sensitive and intelligent these animals could be. Some came out of curiosity, others out of arrogance, but the result was always the same. Mistakes could be dangerous. Boss's job was to prevent that no matter what. I understand that, Boss replied calmly, his voice firm but not angry. But every horse is different. You can't just assume what works with one will work with another. They respond to trust, patience, and respect. That's something you can't fake or force. He gestured toward the stables, subtly signaling that the stranger should stay back. The horses, who had sensed the growing tension, shifted slightly, their ears twitching and hooves moving nervously on the ground. Boss noticed every detail, the smallest change in posture or sound, and adjusted his own stance accordingly. The stranger frowned, clearly frustrated by the restriction. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, though his words did little to mask the challenge in his tone. "I just want to see them up close." His hand twitched as if he wanted to reach out again, testing the boundaries. Boss felt a wave of concern. A single wrong touch, a sudden movement, and a horse could react unpredictably. He needed to act carefully, balancing firmness with calm authority to prevent an accident. Boss took a slow, deliberate step forward. "I'm not questioning your intentions," he said, keeping his voice steady. "But this is my responsibility. These horses trust me, and I have to protect that trust. Please step back and observe without touching. That is the rule here, and it is not negotiable." His words were clear and unwavering. He had found that clarity often prevented unnecessary conflict, even with someone who thought they knew better. The stranger's expression hardened. He was used to getting his way, and being told what to do by someone he did not know felt like a challenge. He looked around, perhaps hoping someone else on the ranch would intervene or take his side. But the ranch hands were quiet, waiting for Boss's lead. They had learned long ago that Boss had a way of handling situations that avoided harm to both people and animals. They trusted him completely. "Fine," the stranger muttered, taking a small step back, but it was clear he was far from willing to give up entirely. He continued to watch the horses intently, his body tense. Boss could feel the air thickening with unease. The horses, sensing the stranger's hesitation and subtle tension, became slightly restless. One of the stallions pawed at the ground, another shifted nervously in its stall. Boss knew that animals were incredibly perceptive. They could detect fear, uncertainty, and even hidden intentions. He had to stay fully alert. Boss glanced around the stables, noticing every detail, the placement of the feed buckets, the fences, the nearby tools. He had trained himself to see potential risks in his environment. Even a small distraction could turn into a serious problem. He knew the stranger might not understand the fragility of the situation. One careless movement could startle a horse, and in an instant, a calm morning could become dangerous. He silently prepared for every possibility, ready to step in at a moment's notice. The stranger's eyes lingered on a young mare, her coat shiny and her movements graceful. She was curious, stretching her neck to see him better, and her ears flicked back and forth. Boss noticed the subtle tension in her posture. Horses communicated constantly through body language, and even small signs could indicate discomfort or unease. He moved slightly closer, positioning himself between the stranger and the mare, ensuring a protective buffer. "You can watch," Boss said, his voice calm but firm. "But you cannot touch them. Do you understand?" His gaze held the stranger's, leaving no room for argument. It was a test of compliance and respect. Boss had learned that setting boundaries clearly and consistently was the most effective way to maintain order and safety. The stranger nodded slowly, but his body language betrayed impatience. He wanted to get closer, to interact with the horses in a way that Boss could not allow. Boss noticed the subtle tension growing again, not just in the stranger, but also in the horses. Their instincts were telling them something was off. Boss took another deep breath, steadying himself. He had to remain calm, confident, and in control. Panic or anger would only make the situation worse. As Boss spoke, he kept his movements deliberate and slow. He patted one of the horses gently on the neck, signaling reassurance and calm. The horse relaxed, leaning slightly into his hand. This small gesture was enough to show the stranger that the horses trusted Boss completely, and that any interaction needed to go through him. The stranger's eyes flicked from Boss to the horse, as if he was beginning to understand the depth of Boss's authority and experience. Time seemed to stretch. The morning sun climbed higher, casting warm light over the stables and fields. The stranger remained, curious but cautious. Boss continued to monitor both him and the horses, aware that any misstep could trigger a reaction. He silently weighed every possibility, every potential outcome, as if calculating the safest path forward. His years of experience had trained him to think ahead, anticipate movements, and respond before a situation escalated. Finally, Boss spoke again, his tone steady and measured. "If you follow the rules, everything will be fine. But if you ignore them, you risk not only your safety but the trust and well-being of these horses. That is not something I can compromise." The words were firm but not hostile. They conveyed authority without aggression, setting a clear boundary. The stranger hesitated, sensing the seriousness in Boss's voice. He glanced at the horses again, noticing how calm they were with Boss but restless in his own presence. It was a subtle lesson that he could not ignore. Slowly, he stepped back a few more feet, nodding in reluctant agreement. While his curiosity remained, he began to understand that this was not a place for casual handling or disrespect. The ranch hands relaxed slightly, seeing that the immediate tension had eased, though they remained vigilant. Boss continued to watch carefully, aware that the situation was still delicate. The horses were calming, but the stranger's presence still introduced an element of uncertainty. Boss knew that patience and steady observation were his best tools. Throughout the morning, Boss maintained a careful balance. He allowed the stranger to watch, to learn, but always from a safe distance. He demonstrated the horses' behaviors, showing how they responded to gentle guidance and clear communication. Slowly, the stranger began to observe more thoughtfully, asking questions instead of trying to reach out. Boss answered patiently, using the opportunity to teach and to reinforce the importance of respect, patience, and awareness when working with animals. By mid-morning, the stranger seemed to have shifted his approach. He was no longer challenging Boss or testing boundaries. Instead, he was paying attention, watching carefully, and even showing subtle signs of respect. Boss, while remaining alert, allowed this small progress, knowing that it was better for the stranger to learn from observation than to attempt direct interaction prematurely. The horses themselves seemed to sense the change. Their ears relaxed, their movements became smoother, and their breathing evened out. Boss felt a quiet relief, knowing that the immediate tension had passed. The morning continued with this careful balance, a lesson in patience, observation, and respect for both the stranger and the animals. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Boss reflected on the delicate nature of his work. Protecting the horses was not just about physical safety. It was about preserving trust, understanding, and harmony. Every decision, every word, every action mattered. The stranger, now observing rather than challenging, had unwittingly become part of this lesson, learning that patience and respect were more powerful than force or recklessness. By the time the morning reached its peak, Boss felt that the situation had stabilized. The stranger had not caused harm, and the horses remained calm and secure. The lesson had been quietly delivered through authority, patience, and careful observation, a reminder that experience and respect often spoke louder than confrontation or ignorance. The morning stretched on, and the tension on the ranch grew heavier, though it was mostly invisible to anyone who hadn't witnessed the subtle interactions between man and horse. Boss had kept a calm, steady presence, but he knew that the situation was far from over. The stranger was no longer as bold as before, but there was still a sense of curiosity mixed with stubbornness in his every movement. Horses could sense hesitation, indecision, or hidden intentions, and some of them were becoming slightly more alert again, ears twitching and muscles tensing. Boss understood immediately that this was the critical moment, the moment when he needed to assert control firmly, decisively, but without causing alarm. He watched the stranger step a little closer to one of the stalls, perhaps thinking the horses would respond the same way they did with him. Boss's eyes narrowed slightly. He had seen this before. People often assumed that animals would behave the same way for everyone. They didn't. Horses formed trust carefully over time, and that trust could be broken instantly by one careless action. Boss moved toward the stall in a slow, measured pace, each step deliberate, signaling authority while maintaining calm. "You need to stay back," Boss said, his voice low but firm. "I've asked you politely. Now I need you to follow my instructions immediately. Step back and keep your distance." The stranger froze, as if hearing the gravity of the words for the first time. His hand, which had drifted slightly toward the horse, stopped in midair. He looked at Boss, trying to gauge whether this man would really enforce his words. The quiet in the stable seemed to thicken. Even the horses paused, sensing the change in energy. Boss had trained himself to notice these moments, to understand that when tension reached this level, every small action could shift the outcome either toward calm or chaos. "You don't understand," the stranger said, his voice rising slightly with frustration. "I'm just trying to—" "You don't understand the rules here," Boss interrupted, his tone sharper now, though still controlled. "You are on my property. These are my horses. Their safety is my responsibility, and I will not compromise it for anyone. Step back now." The words carried weight. Boss's voice wasn't angry. It was steady, firm, and filled with authority. He had learned long ago that yelling or aggression could frighten a horse, but a calm, unwavering tone combined with deliberate actions commanded respect from both animals and humans. The stranger hesitated, sensing that this was not a time for argument. Boss shifted slightly, positioning himself directly between the stranger and the horse. His posture was open but strong, signaling that he was ready to act if necessary. The stallion in front of them shifted nervously, its ears flicking back and forth, its hooves scraping against the floor. Boss reached out a hand toward the horse, giving it a gentle pat on the neck. The horse leaned slightly into his touch, calming immediately, but the gesture also reinforced Boss's authority, not just over the animal, but over the situation itself. "You see how he trusts me?" Boss said quietly, speaking to the stranger as much as to the horse. "This trust is built over years. You can't just step in and expect it to remain the same. Respect it or leave." The stranger's face hardened. There was a flash of defiance, but also hesitation. Boss could see that he was beginning to realize the seriousness of the situation. He had not allowed the stranger to physically threaten the horses yet, but the possibility existed, and Boss had to be ready. Years of working with horses had taught him that preparation was key, anticipating movements, staying alert, and acting decisively. The tension in the air thickened. The stranger's body language became sharper, his steps slightly uneven. He was trying to maintain his composure, but Boss could see the small signs of uncertainty: a tight jaw, shifting weight, hands fidgeting. Even small changes in posture could be significant, and Boss was trained to notice them. "You need to leave the stables," Boss said again, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable firmness. "Step out now and no one will be hurt. I am serious about this. You are risking your safety and the safety of the horses." The stranger's eyes flicked toward the horses, then back to Boss. For a moment he seemed to consider leaving. But instead he took another small step forward, perhaps thinking that Boss was bluffing or that the horses would remain calm. Boss's instincts kicked in immediately. He could not allow even the smallest risk. A sudden movement, a startled horse, a panicked reaction, it could all happen in an instant. He had to act decisively. Without breaking eye contact, Boss took a deliberate step closer, positioning himself fully between the stranger and the stallion. His presence was firm, unwavering, and deliberate. He knew that any sudden, frantic movements could alarm the horses, so every motion had to be calm, controlled, and confident. "You are not stepping closer," Boss said firmly. "I am giving you one last chance. Step back or I will remove you myself." The stranger froze, realizing that Boss was not bluffing. For the first time, his bravado faltered. He glanced around, perhaps hoping someone else would intervene or back him up, but the ranch hands remained silent, watching Boss lead. The authority of experience, calmness, and knowledge was clear. No one dared challenge him. Seeing the seriousness in Boss's eyes, the stranger finally took a small step backward. His shoulders stiffened, his hands tightened, and he muttered under his breath. Boss did not respond immediately. He held his ground, ensuring that the stranger's retreat was complete before relaxing slightly. The horses, sensing the change, shifted back into calm postures, ears forward, breathing steady. Even as the immediate threat eased, Boss did not let his guard down. He knew that situations like this could flare up again if boundaries were not clear and enforced. Horses were sensitive to tension, and even the stranger's lingering curiosity could provoke a sudden movement. He maintained a steady presence, patting a nearby horse, offering reassurance and keeping his eyes on the stranger. "You are free to observe," Boss said quietly, his tone measured. "But only from a safe distance. If you cannot respect that, you must leave. These are not toys or objects for amusement. They are living beings, and their safety comes first." The stranger nodded, though his pride seemed slightly bruised. He stayed where he was, no longer reaching toward the horses, watching with more caution than before. Boss had succeeded in asserting control, protecting the animals, and setting boundaries clearly without escalating the situation into a confrontation that could have been dangerous. For a moment, the ranch was quiet except for the natural sounds of life. Hooves shifting on the floor, soft snorts from the horses, the distant rustling of leaves. Boss took a deep breath, feeling a quiet satisfaction. He had handled the situation not with anger or force, but with authority, patience, and calm decision-making. The stranger had learned, even if silently, that respect, observation, and adherence to rules were far more powerful than impulsive action. Boss glanced at the ranch hands who were watching carefully. He gave a small nod, signaling that the immediate danger had passed. Their eyes reflected relief and admiration. They had learned from experience that Boss's ability to act decisively and calmly in tense situations was what kept both people and animals safe. The horses themselves seemed to understand. Their movements smoothed, their breathing relaxed, and their ears flicked attentively but without tension. Boss patted one of the stallions again, whispering softly, "Good. You're safe." It was a quiet victory, one that required vigilance, authority, and understanding more than anything else. The stranger, now observing rather than acting, began to ask questions, slowly shifting his curiosity into genuine interest rather than recklessness. Boss answered patiently, showing how horses responded to gentle guidance, consistent communication, and clear boundaries. The lesson was being delivered through action rather than conflict, and the stranger's posture softened as he listened and watched carefully. By late morning, the intensity of the confrontation had passed. Boss remained alert, but he could feel that the critical moment, the climax of potential danger, had been navigated successfully. The stranger had tested the boundaries, and Boss had responded decisively, ensuring the safety of everyone involved. In that quiet, sunlit stable, Boss reflected on what had just occurred. Protecting the horses had required awareness, patience, authority, and decisiveness. It was a reminder that leadership often meant standing firm, maintaining calm under pressure, and never compromising on what was truly important. The morning's events would stay with him and the stranger as a lesson in respect, trust, and the responsibility that comes with caring for animals. After the tension of the morning had passed, a quiet stillness settled over the ranch. The stranger no longer advanced toward the horses but stood at a respectful distance, observing with curiosity rather than defiance. Boss remained vigilant, his eyes scanning both the stranger and the horses, ensuring that no sudden movement would trigger another wave of anxiety. The air felt lighter now, though every sound, the clatter of hooves, the rustling of leaves, the faint calls of birds, reminded Boss that life on the ranch was always dynamic. He had learned that calm after tension was just as important as authority during it. The horses themselves seemed to breathe easier. The stallion that had been so nervous earlier lowered his head, grazing softly at the hay. A mare in the next stall nudged her foal, who looked up with bright, trusting eyes. Even the younger horses, who had been skittish with the stranger's presence, began to move more confidently, their curiosity returning in a controlled, careful manner. Boss walked among them, speaking softly, patting necks, and offering gentle encouragement. These small actions reassured the horses and re-established the trust that was essential to the ranch's harmony. The ranch hands began to relax as well. They had been tense during the confrontation, watching Boss handle the situation with calm authority. Now, seeing the stranger keep his distance and the horses calm, they exchanged quiet looks of relief. Boss had shown them once again that experience, patience, and firm leadership were far more effective than anger or force. Every hand movement, every word, and every step had contributed to a successful resolution, and the ranch hands silently acknowledged this. Boss turned his attention back to the stranger. "You can observe," he said quietly, "but remember this is not a place for casual interaction. The horses respond to respect, patience, and understanding. You cannot force them to trust you, and you cannot risk their safety. Do you understand?" The stranger nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. There was still a hint of pride in his voice, but also a new respect. He had seen the consequences of ignoring rules, and he understood, at least in part, the care required to work with horses. Boss had not just protected the animals. He had taught a lesson, quietly but effectively. Over the next hour, Boss demonstrated the daily routines of the ranch to the stranger. He showed how to approach a horse safely, how to read their body language, and how to communicate without startling them. The stranger watched closely, asking occasional questions, his curiosity now guided by caution rather than impulsiveness. Boss answered patiently, explaining why each action mattered. Even small movements, the way hands were held, the tone of voice, the position of feet, could affect how a horse reacted. As the morning moved toward noon, Boss noticed a subtle change in the stranger. He was more attentive, more careful in his observations, and less focused on immediate gratification. It was as if he had realized that understanding and respect were far more valuable than touching or controlling the animals. Boss had guided him through a transition from defiance to awareness, and the results were evident in the stranger's demeanor. The ranch hands began preparing lunch for themselves and Boss, their movements quieter now that the tension had dissipated. Boss walked among the horses again, checking each one carefully. There were no injuries, no signs of stress that hadn't already been calmed. He spoke softly to each horse, reinforcing the trust they had in him. This was his most important responsibility, ensuring that even after a stressful incident, the horses felt safe, valued, and cared for. Boss took a moment to step outside the stables, looking over the rolling fields of the ranch. The sun had climbed high in the sky, casting warm light over the grass and trees. The breeze carried the familiar scent of hay and earth, comforting and grounding him. He allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. Confrontations could happen anywhere at any time, and his role was always the same: to protect the animals and maintain order without unnecessary force. That calm, deliberate authority was what defined him and the ranch. The stranger approached cautiously, keeping a respectful distance. "I didn't realize how sensitive they are," he said quietly. "I've worked with horses before, but not like this. They respond to care and understanding, not just skill or strength." Boss nodded. "Exactly. Horses are intelligent and aware. They notice tension, fear, impatience, and even subtle gestures. You can't rush trust. You have to earn it through patience, consistency, and respect." He paused, looking at the stranger with calm authority. "If you remember that, you will never be a danger to them or to yourself." The stranger remained silent for a moment, clearly absorbing the lesson. Then he nodded again, this time with a quieter, more genuine humility. Boss had seen this kind of change before, the shift from arrogance or ignorance to awareness and understanding. It was subtle, but it was important. People often remembered lessons learned calmly and firmly far longer than those learned through force or anger. Boss returned to the stables, guiding the stranger to observe from a safe distance. He pointed out small details: the way a horse's tail flicked when it was nervous, the tension in its neck muscles, the way ears and eyes moved to gather information. He explained how even small missteps, raising a hand too quickly, stepping in the wrong direction, or speaking in a harsh tone, could trigger panic or stress. The stranger listened intently, now focused on learning rather than testing limits. Time passed, and the morning's intensity gave way to steady activity. Boss led a small training session with some of the younger horses, demonstrating techniques for building trust and coordination. The stranger observed closely, occasionally taking notes in his mind rather than in writing. He asked questions, not challenges, and Boss answered each with patience, explaining the reasoning behind each action and the impact it had on the animal's confidence and behavior. As the training continued, the stranger began to understand the depth of Boss's responsibility. It was more than feeding, grooming, or riding. It was about reading each horse's personality, responding to subtle cues, and maintaining harmony among animals with different temperaments. Boss moved among the horses with a calm authority, guiding, correcting, and reassuring. The stranger could see that this was not just skill. It was a combination of experience, intuition, and respect that came from years of dedication. The ranch hands observed the interaction quietly. They had been part of many such moments with Boss, but each time they witnessed his calm authority in action, it was a reminder of why he was trusted completely. He had managed a potentially dangerous situation without anger, without haste, and without harm. The stranger's change in attitude was a testament to the effectiveness of patience and clear boundaries. After the training, Boss gathered the horses back into the stables. He walked among them, checking for any signs of stress or discomfort. Each horse responded positively to his presence, moving calmly and trusting his guidance. Even the younger horses, who had been skittish earlier, followed him willingly. Boss felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The morning's events had been challenging, but the outcome had been exactly as it needed to be. The horses were safe, the stranger had learned, and the ranch remained harmonious. Boss turned to the stranger one last time. "Remember," he said calmly, "working with horses is not about force or speed. It's about understanding, patience, and respect. If you keep that in mind, you will never have to worry about accidents or misunderstandings. The animals will respond to you, and you will learn far more than you ever imagined." The stranger nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. He had learned an important lesson, not just about horses, but about responsibility, patience, and humility. Boss's firm yet calm guidance had prevented harm and imparted wisdom in a way that would stay with him. As the afternoon approached, the ranch returned to its usual rhythm. The horses grazed, the ranch hands worked, and Boss continued his careful oversight. The memory of the morning's confrontation lingered, but it had been resolved without injury, without panic, and with respect preserved on all sides. Boss knew that this was the true measure of leadership, handling difficult situations decisively while maintaining calm, protecting those who relied on you, and teaching lessons that would be remembered long after the moment had passed. The stranger eventually stepped back, giving the horses space and observing quietly. He seemed different now, more thoughtful, more cautious, and more respectful. Boss watched him for a few moments, acknowledging silently that the lesson had been absorbed. The ranch was safe, the horses were calm, and a potentially dangerous situation had been diffused through awareness, patience, and steady authority. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting warm light over the ranch, Boss allowed himself a moment of reflection. The morning had tested his patience, his authority, and his ability to protect those under his care. But it had also reinforced his confidence in the way he managed the ranch and the animals he loved. Every horse, every hand, every small action had reminded him why experience, respect, and calm decisiveness were so essential. The stranger, now silent and observing respectfully, had become a quiet reminder of the importance of boundaries and authority. Boss knew that the lessons of this morning would stay with him as well. It was not just about protecting the horses. It was about teaching others the value of respect, patience, and awareness in a way that words alone could never convey. The ranch returned to its normal rhythm, but the memory of the morning's events would linger. Boss walked among the horses one last time, patting each gently and speaking softly, reinforcing trust and calm. He felt a sense of quiet fulfillment. The confrontation had been handled, the lessons had been delivered, and the harmony of the ranch had been restored. It was a reminder that true leadership was shown not in anger or force, but in calm authority, careful observation, and the courage to act decisively when needed. The afternoon sun bathed the ranch in warm, golden light, and a gentle breeze carried the fresh scents of hay, earth, and grass across the open fields. The tension of the morning had faded, leaving behind a calm, steady rhythm that reflected both the horses' trust and Boss's careful management. He walked slowly through the stables, patting each horse, speaking softly, and making sure that none of the earlier stress lingered in their bodies or minds. Each movement was deliberate, a combination of reassurance and gentle authority, restoring the peace that defined the ranch. The stranger, now silent, followed at a respectful distance. He had spent the day observing, learning, and gradually understanding the care, attention, and patience that Boss put into his work. Gone were the moments of defiance and ignorance. Replaced now was quiet curiosity and a deepening respect. Boss could sense it, not through words, but in the stranger's posture, the careful way he watched the horses, and the restraint he exercised. The lesson had been learned, the importance of patience, respect, and trust when dealing with these sensitive animals. Boss led the stranger to the central paddock, where the younger horses were allowed to run freely. Their energy was contagious, yet they moved with careful coordination, aware of boundaries even as they explored their space. Boss gestured toward them, explaining, "These young ones are learning not just about running and strength, but about trust, awareness, and discipline. Every movement they make, every reaction is a lesson in communication and respect. You can't rush it and you can't force it." The stranger nodded slowly, watching the horses with renewed attention. He had seen the potential for danger earlier, and now he was beginning to appreciate the subtlety and complexity of Boss's work. Horses were not just animals to be trained. They were intelligent, aware, and sensitive beings. Their reactions mirrored the energy around them, and they demanded patience, consistency, and understanding. Boss had demonstrated all of this calmly, firmly, and without harm, and the lesson was sinking in. After observing the younger horses for some time, Boss walked to the older stallions, his movements deliberate and confident. He spoke to the stranger as he worked, pointing out small details, the tilt of an ear, the shift of a hoof, the tension in a neck muscle, that could indicate emotion, intent, or stress. "You have to notice everything," he said softly. "Horses communicate constantly, and if you miss the signs, you could misinterpret their behavior and cause unnecessary fear or injury. You have to be aware, patient, and ready to respond appropriately." The stranger listened intently, clearly impressed. He had thought working with horses was about skill, strength, or experience alone, but he was beginning to realize that the true foundation of trust came from respect, patience, and understanding. Boss had not just protected his animals. He had opened the stranger's eyes to an entirely different way of seeing and interacting with them. As the afternoon progressed, Boss allowed the stranger to assist in small ways, always from a safe distance and under careful supervision. He demonstrated how to groom a horse properly, how to approach without startling it, and how to read subtle body language. The stranger followed instructions carefully, his confidence growing, but always tempered by respect and caution. Each interaction was a learning moment, reinforcing the lessons of the morning: authority, patience, and the responsibility that came with working around these magnificent creatures.